Hey everybody, welcome to the Blendr Report, where news meets rational thinking. I'm your host, Jonathan Harvey. This is your co-host, Liam DeBoer. And today we are chatting about the Coutts Border and Freedom Convoy with Gord Magill, a Canadian-born trucker who has written for Newsweek and appeared on Tucker Carlson's podcast. Gord, thanks for joining us.
Hey, gentlemen. Thank you for having me.
So why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself first, how you got into this space, how you got wrapped up in the whole Coutts Border issue, and then we can, once we know a little bit more about you, we can dive into the issue itself.
Well, I'm really a Fed in a plant from CSIS and highly paid by the government.
So this is going to be a short podcast. Super cool.
No, my name's Gord. Born in Hamilton, Ontario. Been a trucker my entire life. I was hauling coils around Hamilton before I finished high school. Drove all over the country, ran the ice, drove truck in Australia and New Zealand and all around the U.S. Done a lot of traveling in my life. I live in the United States now, that's true. Moved here in 2016, married a beautiful American woman. As the Guess Who would put it, I didn't want her to stay away from me. She's great. And at the time of Freedom Convoy coming to Ottawa, I was keenly aware of everything going on back home. I've got lots of family in Canada and friends, and we're all online now, and we can see everything happening in the world. And when the Freedom Convoy rolled into Ottawa, I felt it was my sort of patriotic duty to come home and stand in solidarity with my fellow Canadians and fellow truckers. So I did. I drove to Ottawa. It's about 5 hours from where I live in upstate New York. Welcomed the convoy to Ottawa, hung out for that first weekend. Unfortunately, I had to return home. But while I was in Ottawa, my very tiny Twitter account at the time, I posted a bunch of live videos from the overpass we were on out by Almont, into town that night, from the sort of techno dance parties that were happening right out in front of Parliament. And I guess some people who were aware of I'd already been writing on trucking labor market stuff, like sort of very niche, trucking related things. And some people who were aware of my writings saw the videos and invited me to write some more on the Freedom Convoy. So I did. One of those outlets was Newsweek. That led to a very fortuitous interview with Laura Ingraham on Fox. 36 hours later, my Twitter account was nuked. One of my best friends told me never to talk to her again because, apparently going on Fox News makes you an instant fascist, no discussion. And, I felt very strongly that what went on under the COVID regime of Justin Trudeau, as has gone on in so many other places, was wrong. And I wanted to, stand in solidarity with my Canadian trucker friends. I did so, and I've been writing about it ever since.
Amazing. Yeah, it's funny. I think a lot of us that were willing to sort of speak out or speak our mind or just kind of live in the world of logic, we lost a lot of friends through that whole COVID situation. Before we jumped on, you kind of asked a little bit about us. We thought we'd save it for the pod. So the reason I got into a lot of this stuff, I've been an entrepreneur for about 15 years now in the restaurant business. And the first 2 weeks, I was like, okay, cool, man. I'll just, have wine for dinner and take a nap. I could use the break. And then it was another 2 weeks, then months. And then by the third lockdown, I was like, oh, fuck, I'm going to lose everything. And then I started speaking out. And I stayed logical with the whole thing, not too opinion-based, just really using the government's own data to be like, hey, you got this completely wrong. Just sort of calling out the mainstream media. And that's did the same thing for me in a sense that it did for you, is it sort of built a bit of a following. And I kind of found my voice through a lot of that. And that's kind of why I continue doing the stuff we're doing with Blendr. It was really like, there's a need for alternative media in the world today, especially in a place like Canada, because they've basically nationalized the media. You know what I mean? Like everything's subsidized in some way through the government. So we looked at that, and that's really why we started up with Blendr. And kind of the reason we're here today, the reason we wanted to chat with you was, we got something sort of wrong with the Coutts border situation where, those two guys were thrown in jail for, I think it was 6.5 years. They got time served for 4. But based on the information we saw, it seemed like the punishment fit the crime. But then when we heard from you and some other people, we're like, oh, we've got this all wrong. And hey, there it is. The mainstream media kind of skewed the story once again.
Oh, yes. Did they ever?
So why don't we actually just start from the beginning first, kind of just even talking about, like, let's imagine here that listeners have no idea even what the Coutts border issue was, maybe go from the beginning, even just what happened at Coutts border itself, how that was tied to the Freedom Convoy, and then we can get into the fallout after that.
Sure. So the main part of the Freedom Convoy went to Ottawa, right? Everybody knows about that. The 3 weeks, the bouncy castles, all the fun in Ottawa. Other locations were less well known, including Windsor, Pembina, North Dakota, Emerson, Manitoba. There was a protest there. I think that might have been the first one, south of Winnipeg. And there was another at Coutts. Coutts is a little tiny village, about a 4-hour drive south of Calgary, right on the border with Montana. And there's a border crossing there where Interstate 15 meets the Alberta Provincial Highway number 4. It's the biggest and busiest border crossing in that part of the country, basically between Vancouver and Winnipeg. Lots of truck traffic, lots of car traffic. And it was selected as a protest site by some people in Alberta who couldn't make it to Ottawa. And it was a pretty substantial number of people went. Lots of trucks, lots of cars, lots of campers. There's videos and photo footage of it all over the internet. Like, Coutts was a pretty big deal. And the RCMP and the government were casing the joint, and in fact were monitoring the communications between the people who were organizing Coutts and getting people to go there before it even happened. I believe the first date of revealed government acknowledgement of looking at organizers' communication was January 25th, and nobody showed up in Coutts until the 29th.
So when they're looking at those communications, are we talking about, say, looking at public discussions that were happening on social media channels like, say, Twitter, or were they actually, like, say, going in a back door and looking at the messages?
Well, I believe a lot of it was monitoring public stuff. There's been a release of these documents from an ATIP request. I think it's called Access to Information and Privacy Act, which show that once the protesters did arrive in Coutts, the more, what shall we say, thorough examinations of the people protesting began in earnest by our friends in the RCMP, where they were running people's plates, running people's names, checking them against the gun registry. So if you are a lawful PAL holder who happened to have rifles and shotguns, they were checking against that. Right, so the RCMP and the government were like pretty well monitoring things right from the word go.
How long did the Coutts border blockade last, and then how did it ramp down? Like, what happened there that caused it to fizzle out?
So it started on January 29th. They kind of had a sort of encampment, and people had RVs, and they stayed local properties. People had trailers, parked on people's private property, within a certain distance of the town of Coutts and the border crossing where the protest site was. And it lasted until, I believe, everybody pulled out on February 15th, which would have been the next, people started being arrested on the night of February 13th, 2022, and people started leaving on the 14th, and then on the 15th, it was pretty much done and dusted.
How many people got arrested on that, between the 13th and 15th?
So between the 13th and the 14th of February, 13 separate people were arrested in connection with the Coutts protest. One of the people arrested wasn't even arrested at Coutts. And 9 of those folks were released soon thereafter. And 4 of the people released, Jerry Morin, Chris Lysak, Chris Carbert, and Tony Olyanek, were kept in custody for 2 years. Mr. Carbert and Mr. Olyanek remain in custody, and I think we're now 32 months since they were arrested.
What was it that they were being held for that long?
So this is where it gets political and why I refer to them as political prisoners. The RCMP and the Crown, specifically Crown Prosecutor Stephen Johnston, whom, in my opinion, was in communication with people much higher than him in the RCMP, who I believe were directing him to find anything to help justify the invocation of the Emergencies Act. Johnston and the cops, they began tapping phones. They got wiretaps, some of which were legal, some of which were not. They executed search warrants on people's campers and accommodation in Coutts, some of which was legal, some of which was not. And in the evidence they found and in the monitoring of people's communications, they took maximally negative interpretations of smack talk and concocted that into a fantasy of these four men conspiring to murder police officers. And the jury, back in August, agreed with my assessment of that by rendering a not guilty verdict on that charge. But because of the conspiracy to murder police officers, judges involved with the granting of bail in Alberta believe that to be such a heinous potential crime that if they let these guys out, it would bring the justice system into disrepute. Even though 3 of the 4 gentlemen had no criminal records, the one gentleman who did was for a simple drug possession when he was a kid. So no history of violence, perfectly upstanding citizens. Bunch of these guys owned their own businesses. All of them worked. All of them were tradesmen of one degree or another. Perfectly normal working class dudes. They had no plans on killing anybody. The whole thing was a manufactured conspiracy by the government. And you know when the government does things, right? When they accuse you of something, they're projecting themselves. The conspiracy here was on the part of the state, in my opinion.
What did they actually get these guys for when it came to these charges that we kind of know are, well, they're not fair, they're bunk, whatever you want to call them?
So Tony Oleanick was convicted of 3 charges and Chris Carbert of 2. The other 2 guys, as an aside, Chris Lysak and Jerry Morin were let out in February, about a week before they would have been inside for 2 years. All of the original charges against them were dropped, and they accepted, Chris Lysak accepted a plea deal related to a very minor technical gun mishandling charge because he did have a pistol. He claims to have forgotten about it. And when you have a pistol in Canada, you're supposed to have a travel permit that dictates where you can take it, which is basically between your house and a licensed gun club. He was outside that travel permit. Now, if you are caught breaking that travel permit, typically there's a fine or they might take your pistol off you. You don't get 2 years in jail. So Chris Lysak pled out on that. Jerry Morin pled out on what amounts to a false confession. Everybody knows it. His lawyer knows it. He knows it. The Crown knows it. And when the Crown was considering evidence in the trials of Tony Oleanick and Chris Carbert, Justice Lebrenz told the jury that Morin's confession wasn't worth the paper it was written on because these types of confessions drawn under duress, people will say anything to get out. Jerry Morin was kept in Calgary remand with the worst of the worst. Murderers, rapists, gangs. He was in a gang unit. He was kept in solitary confinement for like somewhere on the order of like 90 or 100 days. And this is all pretrial. This is a guy who's got no criminal record, perfectly upstanding citizen, and he was kept in solitary confinement, which is considered a form of torture by most Western countries.
Wild.
Right.
That is so wild.
Yeah, that's totally true. I'm not making this up. Imagine why the media didn't bother reporting on that to anybody. So anyway, those 2 guys get out in February. A similar plea deal is offered to Tony Oleanick. Crown Prosecutor Johnston, and this was covered under a publication ban before trial, Johnston offered Tony Oleanick 8 years on sedition. Just plead guilty to sedition and we'll drop everything else. Because, am I allowed to swear?
Yeah.
Fuck yeah.
Motherfucker knew he didn't have a case. He knew it was a fantasy, and he's guilty of prosecutorial misconduct, amongst other things. So Tony Oleanick told him to pound sand, and we'll see you in court.
Yeah.
So Tony Oleanick was charged with weapons for a dangerous purpose, possession of weapons for dangerous purpose, mischief, and possession of an explosive device. Chris Carbert was charged with mischief and possession of a weapon for dangerous purpose. They were found guilty on all those minor charges. The explosives for a dangerous purpose thing was a target of opportunity by the Crown when the RCMP searched Tony Oleanick's place, because Tony Oleanick and his late father, George, ran a gravel quarry. They used to mine sandstone, amongst other things. And they used to use these little tiny industrial explosives for loosening drill bits and for other purposes on their quarry. And the 2 pieces of little explosive they found for industrial purposes were like 12 years old, I think, at the time when they found them. They were from 2010. But did you ever hear about that in the media? No, it was pipe bombs, pipe bombs, pipe bombs. One of Tony Oleynik's business associates testified in court that they were exactly that, industrial explosives. A Crown explosive specialist testified to like how rusty they were and how hard it was to open the things up and actually get the powder inside to test them to, present at trial. So that whole thing was a sham. But technically speaking, because they were so old, even though they were found in a container, even though they were found 200 kilometers away from the protest site, technically speaking, under the law, Tony was supposed to have a permit for them. They weren't able to find one, even though he claims his dad did have them in the past. Guilty. Does that have anything to do with the protest? Are those pipe bombs that were going to be used to harm people? Not a chance in hell. The weapons for a dangerous purpose charge are because, people in Alberta have guns. It's not illegal to have guns. All four of those guys, registered gun owners, licensed gun owners, they all had PALs. Everything they were doing was safe and perfectly legal. Tony Oleynik actually brought his shotgun in 22. He didn't even bring it to Coutts. That was a mistake. Tony brought his own dump truck to Coutts from the gravel quarry he ran. And then a friend of his brought his pickup, and Tony had this 22 and this shotgun in his pickup truck, which he was driving around Coutts as he was sort of acting as kind of like, volunteer security. When he discovered that they were in there, he said to Chris Carbert, "Hey man, I shouldn't have these things in my pickup truck. This is bad news. Can I store them in your trailer? Because I shouldn't be driving around here with guns. That's just going to get me in trouble." So he tried to do the right thing, and they convicted him for it anyway. The mischief charges, everybody in Canada involved with Freedom Convoy was charged with mischief. Chris Barber, Tamara Litch, all the people that nobody even knows, the Jay Vanderweers, the Guy Meisters, the Christine DeCaires, the hundreds of other people who were charged in Ottawa. They just carpet bombed everybody with mischief charges, right? And I guess the jury sort of went along with Johnston's argument for them being guilty of that.
So before we get into the speculation of things on why this is occurring, I thought it might be a good idea. Is there a way to steelman, say, law enforcement's reaction and what they did after the fallout of Coutts border? Is there a way to steelman it from their perspective as to, hey, we're just trying to, say, carry out law and order?
Okay, you could possibly steelman their argument insofar as perhaps, in the minds of urbanite Canadians and in the minds of spreadsheet brain people who don't actually live in the country, you're not supposed to carry your guns around with you. Okay. I mean, that's the best steelman I can come up with, because when you look at the sentencing and when you look at the actions of the Crown prosecutors in pursuing this case, when you look at the denial of bail, when you look at the fact that Tony Oleynik and Jerry Morin were both kept for periods of solitary confinement, when you look at the fact that they were denied necessary medical treatment, there's this whole sub-story within the Coutts story of how these guys would, like Tony Oleynik suffers from SIBO. He's got a intestinal bacterial organism growth, and he needs a certain kind of probiotic, which he was denied by Alberta Health Services through Alberta Corrections. Chris Lysak was denied the appropriate footwear and mattresses in jail because he's 6'5" and he's a bodybuilder and he's humongous and wears size 15 shoes. They never gave him any of the appropriate stuff he needed when he was in jail. So they just treated these guys like garbage. The media totally didn't ask any questions about why these guys were kept in solitary and treated this way. And the Crown didn't give a crap either. So this is where it starts being like their steelman of why did these guys have guns meets this terrible treatment they got. Why were they denied bail for 2 years? Why were they not allowed to get out and build their own defense? Why did so many lawyers screw this up? I think they went through something like 12 or 13 different legal counsels between the four of them.
That's insane.
There's just a lot of crazy crap that happened on this case that, where there's smoke, there's fire.
Okay, so I guess the kind of bigger question of this all is why? Why did the government? We always know why the media does what they do. They do it just to continue to stay in favor with the people that are paying them. As they say, don't bite the hand that feeds you. But when it comes to why these guys were pinned, I don't think it was personal. I think they just needed to have a target. I think the government needed something. So what's your interpretation as to why this happened to these guys?
My interpretation is that you are correct. The government needed something to hang the Emergencies Act on. Justin Trudeau and his advisors, through testimony at POEC, admitted that they were considering using the Emergencies Act basically from the word go. They were talking about it like as soon as the trucks got to Ottawa. And because the Freedom Convoy did not provide them the opportunity to use it, right? Like there was never any violence. It was really popular with the public, despite the media smearing campaign and lies. No violence took place. Every piece of violence or property damage that took place in Ottawa was later found not to have anything to do with the convoy at all. Ottawa improved. The streets were cleaned up. It was positive. The homeless had never had it that good. Everybody got fed. There was a dance party and a festive spirit every weekend. Families were coming out. Like the government had nothing to invoke the Emergencies Act with. So they needed something. And that something was those guys at Coutts. And so once they arrested them, charged them with the conspiracy to commit murder, found their safely stored firearms, which they then used in a scary photo that went viral the night before they invoked the Emergencies Act. That photo was that propaganda photo that everybody saw of all those guns was used. That was basically it. And Justice Rouleau, in his ruling at the Public Order Emergency Commission, cited these concerns from Coutts in his sort of, kind of febrile allowance for Trudeau, allowing Trudeau to do what he did, right? So I think those guys were the fall guys for it. And even after the Mosley decision came down earlier this year, which showed that, Trudeau's actions were unconstitutional, unwarranted, unnecessary, and basically rebuked them, I think that the government was never going to let the Coutts guys go, right? They needed
I wonder
that. They
sometimes if go ahead, sir. Sorry, I was going to say, I wonder sometimes, Liam and I have chatted about this, that the government did lose that case and found that they shouldn't have been able to pull the Emergencies Act, but they're what's it called? They're looking for a retrial, essentially. They want to challenge it. So if they want to challenge it, they kind of need something in their corner to say, here's why we're challenging it, and here's why it was justified. And we're wondering maybe if that's why they were certain to follow through on these charges and make sure something stuck. So then when they go back to court, they can point to this case and go, hey, we had no choice. We had to pull the Emergencies Act.
There's that. I have a couple of other theories as well. So that's one of them for sure. Another is that when you zoom out and see what's going on around the world and you see, Keir Starmer in the UK arresting protesters who object to his immigration policies and some of the behaviors of recent migrants to England, when you see the French crackdown on yellow vests, when you see the Biden administration and how they treated January 6th protesters, current sort of neoliberal governments of the world have no idea how to deal with like populist resistance to their policies. They have no idea how to deal with their own native populations of whom they don't care about anymore because they're beholden to stuff like the UN Pact on Migration and the World Economic Forum and all these sort of transnational globalist institutions that really don't care for national sovereignty, whereas populist protesters are more concerned with what's going on at home. Another thing that I think the government's doing here is we have this looming imposition of Bill C-63, which you guys have covered very well. And Bill C-63, should it pass, there's not really any precedent for it, right? Like, because it's a brand new law. So I think what's going on here is if you look at the prosecution of Tony Oleanick and Chris Carbert, the bulk of the prosecution against them is their very own words or words they are alleged to have said. Most of the prosecution's case rested on unproven, unverifiable, and unrecorded allegations of undercover officers, and then text messages and other communications intercepted from Chris Carbert and Tony Oleanick's phones. So this is about communication, which is to say the thoughts in your mind. Stephen Johnston made a big, huge deal about the fact that like Tony Oleanick was well informed and was like thinking about the world and was worried about the United Nations and possibly the Chinese Communist Party. Some might say that Tony Oleanick was a quote-unquote conspiracy theorist. But guess what? It's not illegal to be a conspiracy theorist, and you don't throw people in jail for the views they hold. Bill C-63 seeks to change that, and this case here gives them all kinds of ammunition to go forward with it once it passes.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't think about it that way, but I totally agree with you. They're sort of already setting the precedent. You know, they're dipping their toe in the water before they have the legislation in place, because they were able to sort of leapfrog it with, you know, obviously the guns, and they're saying the explosive and stuff like that. But ultimately, like you said, yeah, this is sort of a speech and thought crime. Yeah, it's pretty wild, man.
Yeah, well, you got to remember, nothing happened at Coutts. They were cute. Like, if you read Justice LeBrenz's statements, like he did a bit of a 180, right? Like, so as you mentioned at the top of the show, Tony and Chris were both sentenced to 6.5 years. Their time served credit is 4. Currently, they're at Calgary remand, and apparently they're going to get transferred to Drumheller, which is, I think, some kind of federal pen. But anyhow, 6.5 years, right? So, possession of weapons for a dangerous purpose. Well, what was the dangerous purpose if, like, the conspiracy charge got thrown out and ruled not guilty? What was the dangerous purpose? They never were planning on hurting anybody. They never did hurt anybody. When the cops closed in, and let us not forget, Tony Oleanick posted a video, and there are other videos as well, of the RCMP at Coutts, and then the night before they arrested everybody, they've got flak jackets, helmets, automatic weapons, smoke canister guns. Like, they're coming in fully materialized and hot, ready to, like, go into a shootout with these guys. And everybody just sort of gave up peacefully. Like, nobody was reaching for their guns. You know, Tony Oleanick, in the last Instagram video that Tony Oleanick posted, like, literally minutes before he was arrested, he was saying, hey, guys, unload your rifles and come have coffee with us. Let's talk. Just like the Freedom Convoy people in Ottawa wanted to talk to the Prime Minister or somebody about these mandates.
Well, one thing, too, that I don't think we've covered yet is even above and beyond just trying to get justification for invoking the Emergencies Act. Something I've long thought of, this goes back even towards medieval times, is what do you do with the dissenters? You throw their head on a stake, and it's less about actually silencing that one individual dissenter rather than sending a message to everybody else, which is, hey, you want to say what these guys said, or you want to stand up like they did to us, this is how it's going to end for you as well. And I think that's something that people are becoming more and more aware of, even in Canada. Like, I have certain friends, you know, this is something that we were even mentioning, we're both kind of new to, even before the COVID shenanigans and stuff. I was loosely paying attention to politics, but I was more interested in history and that kind of stuff. I didn't really care all that much. And same thing with a lot of my friends. But now I have friends that won't even send me certain messages or say things unless we're on Signal, because they're just like, I don't trust this whole scenario anymore. Like, I don't trust that my private messages with a friend won't come up in some random trial for something like this of that sort. And, you know, we don't even plan on having any mass protests or anything of that nature. But you see these things being used against this guy, where 1 second they're saying something in privacy, and the next it's being used against them in a court.
Right, and I mean, if you watch the trial of Tamara Lich and Chris Barber, it's much the same. They were basically trying to, like, hang Chris Barber on things he said on his TikTok videos, you know. And look how long that trial's gone on. Longest mischief trial in Canadian history. Did you know that when their trial started in September, there was a drive-by shooting at a wedding in Ottawa? 2 men were killed, 6 other people were sent to hospital, and that case remains unsolved. They have no idea who did it. No arrests have been made. You know why? 3 of Ottawa's top murder detectives were busy testifying against Tamara Lich and Chris Barber for being the faces of a peaceful protest. There's estimates that the trial of Tamara and Chris has now cost the government somewhere north of $5 million to prosecute.
Jesus.
The Coutts guys, between the 4 men's incarceration, all of the lawyering, the dragged out trial, and everything else, it's even more. It's higher than 10. It's estimated to be between $10 and $20 million. Plus, we have dozens, if not hundreds, of other smaller cases against people like who've been on my podcast. There's a young woman named Christine DeCare from Peterborough, Ontario. She went with her boyfriend to Ottawa. They parked their pickup truck on Nichols Street. They were arrested after the Emergencies Act dropped. They charged her and her boyfriend with all kinds of garbage that she was not guilty of. In 2023, the courts agreed and acquitted her of her charges. The Crown appealed her charges. There was another gentleman who was also charged, acquitted, and the Crown's appealing it again. They're engaging in lawfare, right? So Justin Trudeau went on very famously, I believe it was Stephen Colbert yesterday or the day before.
Sure
and,
did.
Colbert being a typical American shitlib, Pierre Poilievre is importing Trumpism to Canada, which is something people in Canada say about Poilievre or anybody on our side of the street. But when you look at the evidence of what's actually happening in the government, what's being imported to Canada? The practice of lawfare, of the government using its position of power, even though they don't have a case against people, just keep throwing lawsuits at people, keep charging them with stuff and tie them up in court. They know they're going to lose, but they're going to waste taxpayer money anyway because that's what you said before. They're trying to send a message. That's what's being imported to Canada. What else is being imported to Canada? Judicial activism. The former head of the Supreme Court of Canada, Beverly McLaughlin, and the current head of the Supreme Court of Canada, Justice Richard Wagner, both said in the media that the Freedom Convoy was anarchy and that the government should do whatever is possible to shut these protests down. I'm sorry, you guys are judges. You don't get to say that unless there is a case in front of you and you're ruling on it. That's not kosher. You're supposed to be impartial. You're out there in the media weighing in on a peaceful protest and telling your fellow Canadians from your position as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court that these people are anarchists that need to be dealt with? What?
Yeah.
Right? So we're seeing the importation to Canada is of American stuff that the Democrats do.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems like, first of all, to the judicial system, I feel like ours has become completely compromised. I think we're in a situation now where it is politically charged. I mean, at least in the States, you kind of know it already is, but it's happening here, like you said, with stuff like that. And we all know which way it's already leaning. Right. But to sort of the bigger picture, I mean...
On that note, pardon my interruption, 77% of the justices in Canada, 77%. Members of and donors to the Liberal Party of Canada.
Yeah. It's what I've been saying lately too, is that you look at sort of like the teachers in school as well. It's like 90-10. There's so many more that are liberals or Democrats. The problem you have is even if you change leadership from the top and you do have a conservative government, the issue is the people running the institutions are still so hard left leaning that you won't be able to turn them over. So it's basically woven into society now, and I don't know how we unplug, even if we change, like I said, leadership from the top down. But my point too earlier to sort of the bigger picture here, and you sit there and you see murders and drive-bys in Ottawa, except the top detectives are at a court case for these two that were obviously doing nothing really wrong. At the Freedom Convoy this all seems to be about something bigger, which is an idea that they're trying to squash. It seems that the pushback against liberal politics in the West is under siege right now. They're doing everything they can, in my opinion, to shut down not only free speech and the way people are thinking and feeling about. Actually, I should say, more importantly, the way people are thinking and feeling about this. Liam's made a really good point before. When you squash free speech, ultimately what you do is you actually change people's thinking. Because if I can't express an idea to you, well, now you don't even have that thought in your mind, so you don't even process it that way anymore. You just have one story and you stay right there. Maybe not on purpose, but that's kind of the way it plays out. And it seems that is the bigger goal of the apparatus in the West right now, is to crush any dissent to this Western liberal ideology.
Right, yeah. Well, like Orwell said, they're trying to build a ministry of truth.
Yeah, exactly.
And America actually officially tried to do that, didn't they, with the Department of Disinformation or whatever?
Right.
Yeah.
So there was another, speaking of the disinformation, so there was another news item here that came out about a month ago, 5 or 6 weeks ago. There's a really great account on Twitter called CBC Watcher, and he dug up this blog from the United States called AmmoLand, and then they just talk about gun stuff. And the AmmoLand guys had put in a FOIA request for documents relating to the American government, engaging in, lawfare and spying on various people in the gun rights movement in the United States. So this gentleman gets the documents and goes through them. And what he found was that the government also gave him documents related to the Department of Homeland Security and what was at one time called the Disinformation Governance Board, which was scuttled. And then all those people were shunted off to the FBI, and who knows what they're doing over there now. But in these documents, it showed that this Disinformation Governance Board were discussing the possibility of getting Twitter and Facebook to throttle the accounts of anybody talking about the Freedom Convoy at the time in 2022. So this was a discussion that was literally had by American deep state bureaucrats who are unelected and unaccountable to quash the free speech rights of Canadians.
It's pretty insane.
And so was there any pressure, like, with that freedom of information request there? Did anything come out? Like, was Canada pressuring U.S. officials to use?
No, they were doing it on their own, according to those documents. However, there is an American connection to this, because anybody who was paying attention during the Freedom Convoy knows that, like, the border crossing protests, the Americans weren't so concerned about what was going on in Ottawa. They were more concerned about the protest at the Ambassador Bridge between Windsor and Detroit, and at Coutts, because of the flow of traffic, because now money is involved, and because of the very close relationship between automotive companies and parts manufacturers and steel producers on both sides of the border, that the American car manufacturing industry was in peril of having their plants shut down and losing millions of dollars. So, I mean, that's kind of bogus, because, like, Port Huron was still open, and the Buffalo Fort Erie Peace Bridge crossing was still open, and there was still ways to get around it. Like, the border wasn't shut, just one crossing had a protest at it, right? But Biden and Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg were in discussion with Freeland and a bunch of Trudeau's underlings, and there's a very famous phone call that happened directly between Prime Minister Trudeau and President Joe Biden, in which Justin Trudeau said to Biden, "I have a plan to deal with this," right? Well, what was that plan? I don't know. A lot of people don't know. And guess what? During the Public Order Emergency Commission, all these documents were supposedly released to show what the government was up to during the Freedom Convoy protests. 17,000 of those documents are still under seal as classified, right? And 800 of them are considered top secret. Why would there be top secret government documents in relation to a peaceful protest where no violence took place?
Yeah, we're just under siege, bro. This is the mess. This is the mess.
What do those documents say?
I think that America would get involved in the sense like I'm starting to see this as a post-national issue where, anybody in the West, if they're going, okay, if this is happening in Canada, how is this going to trickle down into our economy and our society? How is this going to instigate the same problems they're having there down here? So when you see an issue that's big enough, they'll just jump right in and be like, all right, we gotta squash this from down here. And especially America, they're the world's bully, of course, right? But so I think we're pretty much all on the same page that shit's kind of fucked up. It's not good in this country. But so do you have any ideas on how we might reverse course, correct course, make Canada great again, whatever you want to call it? You know what I mean? Do you have any ideas there?
That's a good question. I'm probably, I have as many ideas as you guys do. I mean, I'm just one person. I've been following politics basically since, the Bush v. Gore election in 2000 is when I started really paying attention to stuff. So 1999, I guess, when I was about 20 years old. And then obviously the Iraq War, post 9/11. I came of age in a very weird time in world history. When the Patriot Act was passed and is still in place. If you ever travel to the United States, in the first 100 miles anywhere within the American border or coast, any protections of the Constitution, any rights you have regarding the police or the Border Patrol don't exist. That's all subsequent from the Patriot Act, which is still in place, right? So people haven't been able to get rid of the Patriot Act in the U.S. We haven't been able to get rid of the FISA, the spying on Americans. They haven't been able to get rid of the what's the legislation they keep recycling to like keep all these wars going? That's still going. Once the government, there's nothing so temporary. There's nothing so permanent as a temporary government program. Is the famous quote. I can't remember if that was Milton Friedman or somebody else, but I don't know. I mean, I honestly don't know. I have no faith in politics. There's probably lots of people who are going to listen to this that are, supporters of the Conservative Party or the PPC or they're libertarians or whatever. I don't know what to tell you guys, man. Like, look what happened here with Jagmeet Singh, right? He's in this supply and confidence agreement with Trudeau that happened immediately after the Freedom Convoy because Trudeau knew his goose would be cooked if he got a confidence motion, right?
Yeah.
So Singh is in this in this agreement and then says, well, I'm pulling out of it and makes a big song and dance about it. And then like immediately continues to support him. And even without Singh, the Bloc Québécois lines up and says, here's our opportunity to get what we want, right? So like the whole thing is set up against us. And, to be quite honest, it's a little bit of a mirage in Canada because like, who's really in charge in Canada? Like, as the common understanding is you vote for a representative in the Houses of Parliament, then there's the Senate, then it goes to the Governor General and then the King. Well, there's this little thing called the Privy Council on which King Chuck III sits, a bunch of former prime ministers and appointees, and what they say goes. And most people don't understand that. The Privy Council has like veto power over everything, and they can just do whatever the hell they want, and there's no democratic accountability to it. So like, Canada in many ways is a monarchical dictatorship under King Chuck III and the Privy Council to this day. So, I mean, I don't know what to tell people except, keep reading, keep studying, keep being informed. Don't take any crap from the media, especially like these idiots like the CBC. So one of the things that really annoyed me about the Coutts situation and the idea of keeping people informed, and I touched on this earlier, that like the media has either smeared the men or outright lied about the case or omitted it or were silent. I made a complaint to the CBC ombudsman, and they have to reply because it's a crown corporation and they're supposed to do things in the public interest. So I send them this huge long email expressing my concerns about their coverage of the Coutts case and how for 2 years nobody talked to the defense side, nobody talked to the families, their advocates. That side of the story never got told by the public broadcaster. And then they answered me. So some woman from CBC Calgary, I think her name's Tracy Johnson or something, she basically said, well, what we've done is, what were the words she used? She described it as like fair and, like
I think I've read that because you posted it on your Substack or Twitter or something.
Yeah,
too, right?
I did. What was it? Yeah, fairness and impartial. She described the reporting. Oh, so we have men in prison in a court case that goes on for 2.5 years, denied bail, kept in solitary confinement, all kinds of like weird stuff going on with this case, and yet you guys don't speak about the one half of it that's disfavorable to your masters, right? So Canadians, you have a mandate to keep Canadians informed, but of this great matter, this very important story, for 2.5 years, you say nothing about one half of it completely. Right. We're paying you. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the same on this side of the fence, bro. We unfortunately feel the same way. It's like, I break it down into understanding that there's kind of two kinds of democracy. There's the one that we sort of live in where we think we have a choice. And then there's, like you said, the Privy Council. There's this institutional democracy that's more important. So we get given these leaders down at this level where we get to make a choice, where we think we're choosing who's in charge and what's going to happen, but they're already on board with the institutional democracy at the top. So nothing really changes, unfortunately. And to your point about media, like I said earlier, ours is basically nationalized. Like it's why we do what we do. There's no other independent voices out there. I mean, there are some, don't get me wrong, but there's just not enough. I mean, but I guess, my concern for Canadians, especially young Canadians that have the capacity to get out of the country, is I got one foot out the door here, man. I feel like it's the better option. It's just, there's no real utopia. It's how do you find a place that's got small government, that's democratic, that'll leave you the hell alone? You know what I mean?
I live in the US now. One of the things that sort of gives me hope, of course, this isn't represented in the media at all, is there's still a commitment here to what, you might call small L folk libertarianism. Like, we can all get along and figure this out on our own. We don't need the government to help, live and let live. Although, at least where the government's concerned, live and let live is a one-way street and they don't hold up their end of the bargain. But, there's a lot of people out there that still think like us. And if we constantly focus on the media and the government, we forget that the media and the government, the two wings of what Curtis Yarvin refers to as the cathedral, they are the minority, right? So we have to start thinking about ourselves as the majority, speak amongst ourselves, and come up with our own solutions.
So what are your thoughts on the idea that, I say this frequently, I don't remember whose quote it is. It's definitely not mine, but the idea is that if you want the institutions to work, you have to work for the institutions. And, it's something that I've been thinking, like I've thought about getting into politics a couple times. For me, it's a dark path that I've looked at it a bunch. It's just not going to be, it's not quite right. I don't really want to have my life under a microscope more than it already is. And I also think that you sort of get put in a box where you can't accomplish really as much as you'd like to. But there are a lot of other institutions, whether it's teaching, whether it's policing, there's so many other opportunities there. Do you think that's an effective way for people like us, people that see the world the way we do, to maybe try to help out and change course for Canada? Or do you think it's a bit of a lost cause?
Well, it's hard to say. I don't want to black pill on stuff too much or be a doomer, despite like how much.
I appreciate your honesty either way. It's okay.
Despite how much doom there is, the best effective change you can make is in your own life, and then like what's close proximity to you. I wouldn't tell people to like not try politics out. Like as much as I think, Maxime Bernier's project has sort of run its course. He tried. There's a couple of half-decent politicians here in the United States I wouldn't feed into a wood chipper. Thomas Massey, Rand Paul, Tulsi Gabbard. There's a couple
Tulsi's
of them
great
around, and then there's a couple of like half-decent good state governors. So it's not impossible. It's just difficult.
Right.
Yeah, I think because one thing that it comes to with this is like I see the world as a direct inverse is how a lot of these people we're talking about see the world, the people that currently inhabit these institutions, which is I believe that the world should be organized from a bottom up, that everybody on the bottom should assume responsibility, and then the problems they can't deal with, they hand over to somebody above them. But that's a willing trade rather than how they often see it, which is the people at the top should have dictates that flow down and everybody follows them. And this is something that I think even say the Stoics, like thousands of years ago, pointed out, is that if you want to avoid getting in that situation where you have top-down leadership just giving you an agenda that you have to follow, like you can't cede that ground, because like the political space is always going to be there. It's been around as long as human civilization has been. So if you just become, say, apathetic and remove yourself from those institutions, then all you're doing is giving that ground to the exact people you don't want to have it. So it is kind of still. So in this goes to that idea where even if you're in a, let's say, hopeless situation, it still doesn't do you any good to have that belief that you're in a hopeless situation. So even if you are, you should still put yourself as if you have a chance to, you should still conduct yourself in a way as if you have a chance to change the outcome of that situation.
Right. Yeah. Nihilism doesn't get you very far.
That's mine. Yeah.
You describe doing things from the bottom up. Our friends on the left, our friends who might be communists say the same thing. They just forget about the responsibility and accountability part that comes even from the bottom. So everybody has to be also be responsible and be accountable for yourselves and for whatever project you take on in trying to affect change, right? So like I say, I wouldn't say don't give up, just like be realistic about what you're coming up against, right? So the system as such has done a very good job at trying to insulate itself from people like us, right? This is why, it's almost impossible to fire certain bureaucrats. The system has distributed responsibility for things, right? So if something goes wrong, this person here says, well, it's because I was answering to this guy here, and that guy says I was answering to that guy over there, and then it was subject to this committee, and then the politician says, well, I didn't tell them to do that, and then nothing happens, right? So people ask me, what's my what's my number one policy, let's say, for the next election anywhere, and mine is always accountability for COVID. And I think people need to start demanding accountability. We have to forget these dumb sideshows of Pierre Poilievre and Jagmeet Singh fighting in Parliament, or whatever other dumb crap they're doing, and just keep demanding to your MPs. I want accountability. I want people fired. I want people being prevented from ever holding positions of power again for what they did during COVID. Unless and until you demand, there's a really famous quote, power concedes nothing without a demand. Start making demands, make them loudly, make them forceful, and keep making them. Right?
Yeah, I actually really like that strategy. You can get involved in institutions, but sort of these grassroots efforts to use the power and numbers that we have as constituents to actually sort of, for lack of a better term, enforce policy, I think is actually probably the best way to correct course in this country. I didn't think about that. I'm just kind of processing the idea right now. But to me, that seems like the most effective strategy. It's not only sort of the lowest hanging fruit, but it's something that everyone can contribute to. Everybody can be involved. Everybody can have their say, spread their voice. These ideas can spread pretty quickly through social media. And then as long as you kind of keep your foot on the gas, eventually they have to do something. And we all know they're going to try to give you some sort of half solution that's kind of bullshit anyway. But again, like you said, if you continue to push forward, that's probably the best way to correct a system that I think we all agree is unfortunately not going anywhere. So that's a good idea. I really like that.
Well, I think too, with every single authoritarian regime in the past, there's kind of three options you can take with it. Is you can either support it to try to save your own skin, and that's what the vast majority amount of people do. You can either oppose it and put yourself in a line of fire, or you can just become apathetic and try to not think about any of those scenarios. Into the people in charge of those authoritarian regimes, they don't care whether you're apathetic or for them. A lot of people think that they're trying to rally support and make sure that you're on their side. But to them, if you're apathetic, if you just think that there's nothing you can do, and so that way you check out, that's just as big of a win to them in that scenario. So I'm very much on the same page where you do have to position yourself in a point where you might take some fire, but you've got to actually make some demands from those authoritarians.
Yeah, nihilism is a good lubricant for authoritarians, that's for sure.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess is there anything that would ever bring you back to Canada, or are you simply just you're done with the country?
Well, I didn't move to the United States for politics. I married an American. My wife's here, my kids are here. We have a good in-law and friend network where we live, so it was more about family and community. Although since I've been here, I'm kind of glad I wasn't at home. I would like to come back to Canada. Canada's a great place. If you would have watched my interview with Tucker Carlson, one of his relatives is from Nova Scotia or something. He's got connections to Canada. He loves the place. He recognizes its beauty and the awesomeness of its people. And I agree. I'm one of the few people that can say I've been to all 10 provinces and 3 territories. I drove truck in the Northwest Territories. I've been to all 3 coasts. I love the place. The people who run it are the worst fucking scumbags on planet Earth. And I'm not being hyperbolic. The Laurentian elite, the fucking bureaucrats in Ottawa and Toronto and Montreal and their corporatists that they're all in bed with are utter and complete shitbags. And I don't know that I can live in a place where they're in charge. Because, look what they've done to the culture, man. Trudeau was able to get away with imposing medical apartheid on Canada for a reason. People let it happen. And the powers that be just got rolled over. The people who were supposed to be responsible and accountable to the citizens of Canada did not do their jobs, right? So I guess it's a long way of saying yeah, I do want to come back to Canada someday. I just don't know if that's possible yet.
One of my big goals with everything is just to get people to think about, say, because you hear, for instance, our prime minister say to the New York Times in 2015 that, Canada has no national identity, no mainstream culture, all this kind of stuff, right? And you know what? as much as I don't agree with him, you can actually make that case, because even if you go back to our Constitution, it's in our Constitution that Canada exists to serve the British Empire. So, like, it's not like America in the sense where they fought for their independence and they established themselves as a nation and a proud people. It's from the very beginning of Canada's inception, we were still very much supporting and
it's the whole peace order,
ourselves to a higher
the peace
power.
order and good governance thing. I get that, but that's not to prove Trudeau's assertion, right?
No, but
Canada's
just that
got
there's
its
an
very own
argument for
unique
it,
culture. They're trying to kill it, though, right? So, like, the point of Trudeau saying that again is to legitimate something else, and what they're legitimating is the sort of globalization of the world, where every city looks the same. And all of humanity is like put together into a beige human resource slurry where they can just like shunt it off wherever they need it. And your attachments to place and people and the spirit of where you're from are just completely short-circuited and disconnected from you as a people, right?
And that's where, you know, I'm trying to give the devil his due in that sense. And that's where I think the way forward for Canada isn't to try to return to, you know, like the common catchphrase, you know, make America great again or make Canada great again, is be like, no, let's not try to just return to some historical time period, but actually reimagine what this place could be, because, you know, the British Empire no longer exists. So why do we serve that? So we should actually try to come up with what does it mean to be Canadian, to establish that, and not just assume that there's something in the past that we can just return to, but rather actually establish something concrete to move forward with.
Sure. And in that vein, I'm a big supporter. Like, I mean, this is going to sound ridiculous. We're saying we're trying to preserve Canada. I also sort of support the idea of Alberta seceding and Quebec seceding and doing its own thing. So there's this idea that's like very 20th century, and, you know, we don't even think about it. And it's the fact that, like, borders don't move and nation states don't move, like, unless the United Nations approves it. Like, have you ever heard of any sort of successful independence movement or like one part of a country breaking off for another in recent times that wasn't like approved for geopolitical reasons, right? They like approved of it happening to Russia because, you know, the West and NATO were against them, and they've approved of it in very small handful of other cases. But, like, you know, the American government is very much against states reorganizing themselves. There's all kinds of movements in the United States to, like, you know, there's Greater Idaho, there's the state of Jefferson, there's people in Western Maryland that want to like break off and join West Virginia or something. And the government is set up to prevent that. They want to lock us in time, right? So it's funny you should say that, like, we don't want to like idealize this past, but at the very same time, the powers that be would like that sort of present to remain that way forever, at least until the globalists get their way. Because if there's more fracturing, it makes it harder for these global corporations and globalism and, you know, the sort of, like I say, the forced migration of people and turning everybody into the same thing is much more difficult for them if there's more sovereign states. So they're trying to like lock us into something. And I think the idea of this very 20th century idea of like the world as it is staying that way forever needs to be re-examined.
I completely agree. Anything else you wanted to leave our listeners with today on this topic?
Yeah, just, you know, don't take no shit from these swine. Keep reading, keep talking. You know, don't black pill, man. Like, things are bad, but let's be realistic and, you know, just keep talking, keep writing, keep pushing. Hold these people accountable. Show up at your MP's office and just bang on the door and say, motherfucker, I want accountability for what happened to COVID, or I'm not voting for you. You know, do what you're doing. Make a podcast. Write. I didn't think I could ever write. I only started writing kind of part-time, I don't know, 7 years ago or something, and it didn't even really start getting any traction until Freedom Convoy. So 2 years ago, I've only really been writing, and, you know, look what it's done for me, and I've been able to get a message out. Thomas Massey asked me to contribute a letter to a Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. An essay I wrote went in a book that was given to every member of Congress a couple of years ago. You know, like, if you are knowledgeable about something, if you have a positive idea for change and like how to like fix things or how to correct a mistake or how to make something better, just go do it. Just write about it, podcast, do something. You know, screaming into the wind or blackpilling or not doing anything aren't really an option.
Well, where can listeners find you?
Right. So I do a lot of my writing at autonomoustruckers.substack.com. I occasionally write for Newsweek, The American Conservative, another little magazine called Compact. I've done some stuff for Unheard in the UK. I have a podcast of my own called Voice of Gord. It's been a little slow this summer, hoping to get a couple more episodes out here soon. And just type my name in your favorite non-Google search engine, Gord Magill, on Twitter at Gord Magill. And I hope to meet you on the internet. I'll talk to anybody.
Amazing. Gord, thanks so much. I really appreciate your insight and your just knowledge about, general politics and what was going on with the Coutts. So thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, no, thank you. And one more thing. If anybody wants to help with the Coutts guys, helptony at protonmail.com, helpchriscarbert at gmail.com if you use Interac email money transfers in Canada, or at givesendgo.com/Trudeau's political prisoners if you want to donate to their legal defense funds.
We'll put those links in the description for the podcast as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Take care, everybody. Happy trails.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.